Good evening, everyone. My name is Platon Isaias. I'm the program head of Projective Cities MPhil at the AA. I'm really excited to welcoming to our institution Autonomy UK, Julian Siravo and Will Strong, that they will present their amazing work on issues that are very relevant for all of us as architects, researchers, designers, and I would dare to say citizens. I will briefly give a few information about Julian's bio and Will's, of course, who will speak a bit at the beginning about autonomy before Julian going into the particularities of the urban design and architectural work that Autonomy is doing. So for the past 2 years, Autonomy has been developing research and proposals about the future end of work, tackling themes that range from working time to wages, welfare to workspace. The think tank has developed a unique set of tools and approaches to navigate the ongoing crisis. In this lecture, Julian Siravo, head of Autonomy's urban research branch, takes us for a tour into the engine room of the think tank, explaining how certain ideas from the 4-day week to neighborhood care centers have traveled across media platforms and political arenas. The talk will explore the role and potential of deploying spatial investigation and drawing in a so-called Westminster think tank. Welcome, Julian. A few words about his biography. Julian is an architect and urban designer working in policy. He has spent time in research and commercial architectural practices, eventually gravitating to the think tank world. He has worked for Commonwealth and leads, as I said before, Autonomy's urban research branch. Julian currently teaches history and theory of architecture at UCL, and along with Stephanie Sherman at the SCA city design program as well. A few words about Will. Will Strong is the co-director of Autonomy, and his main focus is on issues relating to the future of work, and he's the co-author with Ellen Hester of the forthcoming book, Post-Work, What Is It? Why It Matters and How We Can Get There, from Bloomsbury. Julian and Will, welcome. We're very happy to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Thanks for having us. This is really exciting. It's not the first time we give a lecture at the A, but certainly for the first time we give it sort of, we have the opportunity to sort of look back a little bit on our work and on the past couple of years. Just a few words on the structure. I brought along with me Will, who is our director. As Platon mentioned, I lead the urban design team. So I'm going to quickly give an intro about how I got involved with the think tank and how I met Will. Will then, in part two, look at sort of how, sort of at the state of autonomy right now, how it works, and partially also where it's going. He will then take us through the history or the journey of one of our main policies, which is the shorter working week. And then I will be taking you through a more one of our more sort of urban proposition, which are long-term care centers. So thanks also to Will for coming along and sharing this with me. So I've been thinking a little bit about how I got involved, our sort of origin story, I guess. And I've been thinking about it through the lens of infrastructure. So the first infrastructure is this pub, the Crown and Sugarloaf. It's this is actually where I bumped into Will, only sort of few months into Autonomy's life. And in fact, it wasn't by chance at all, because the pub is right next to the Mayday rooms, which is to those who don't know it, in the sort of post-squatting era of London, it's one of a handful of places which is still providing infrastructure for left-wing organizing. So it wasn't completely a coincidence that we met in the pub right around the corner. It was after a film screening. Now, the other instance of infrastructure that I want to look at is intellectual infrastructure, and in particular, these three books. I'm not going to go too deep into sort of what they are, but let's just say that together, these three books, which are Inventing the Future, External Feminist Manifesto, and The Problem with Work by Kathy Weeks, outlined the roadmap for what we might call post-work. And I think it was the sort of the nature of that, of the thinking that was being exposed in these books, was something for other thinkers, other practitioners to lean against. And in that sense, it really was infrastructure. And sort of off the back of these ideas, I went off and did my part two, the post-work city. And meanwhile, Will was setting up Autonomy. I sent my research to Helen Hester, who sent it on to Will. And when we met in the pub, we realized that he'd been reading my thesis. Anyway, my point with this little anecdote is that actually was out of these two layers of infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure of the books that I mentioned, and the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure of meeting rooms and pubs, that the sort of third layer of infrastructure was born, which had to do more with media and institutions, and in general creating arenas for left-wing debate. And I guess the point with this little intro is that when our sort of flat world goes back to being 3D, we should keep in mind the importance of those infrastructures. Will, over to you.
Great. Hi guys, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's actually a really nice opportunity to kind of tread the same footsteps as to how we formed and how Julian came into Autonomy's kind of orbit. Let me know if my mic's not working that well, because I think my sound's been mucking up recently. So I'm the director of research at Autonomy and one of the co-founders. Effectively, kind of the origins of Autonomy start in academia. A bunch of academics from a range of disciplines, from political economy to kind of design to philosophy in my case. We're particularly interested in forming an organization which can have a bit more, a kind of greater purchase on the political debates of our time, as well as make some kind of intervention around the future of work in particular. And as Julian said, that's off the back of some of the more interesting texts that are coming out at the time, but also particularly some of the papers coming out around automation. You can name the Oxford, the classic Oxford paper by Frey and Osborne around the future of work and the automatability of industry. So this kind of melting pot of ideas, as well as the fault lines of politics shifting a little bit, it seemed like a good opportunity for a new form of organization. And I say new form of organization because if you know anything about think tanks, they're not normally, well, think tanks are kind of historically, think tanks have been a fairly neoliberal organization. So particularly since the 1970s, 1980s, the think tank as a form is really an organization that basically lobbies certain economic ideas for a particular agenda. So things like the Adam Smith Institute or the IEA and others are basically set up by those in and around Reagan and Thatcher in this country and the US to kind of push a certain economic agenda. Now, in recent decades, we've now had a wider array of think tanks which are basically pushing policy ideas and proposals from all across the political spectrum. But traditionally, they're normally well-funded, large organizations. So we kind of we set out to kind of set something slightly different, slightly more organically grown, I'd say, where we're thinking about what functions are necessary for us to have some kind of political and let's say more public interventions than say academia, where you kind of write a lot of papers, they get put in some journal which no one reads and so on. And so I think we like to think of ourselves as pretty dynamic. We're a very small team. We started with 2, 3, 4 of us. Now there's the team of 8, but nonetheless, we think it's important to stay fairly small to make these kind of pointed interventions. And it's important for us to stay independent. Often, just as I kind of alluded to, when you grow larger and have like a larger kind of array of big funders, you often become quite constrained as to what you can say. And it's important for us to provide a radical voice in these debates, basically. So you're not just saying quite down the line, like fairly centrist kind of proposals. You're actually being able to say something we thought was really necessary. And that's, I won't really talk about the crisis of work, but as Platon introduced, we do think we are in a particular crisis of work for various reasons, and therefore we need a more ambitious voice. And as you can see on your screen, I think ultimately the 2 questions that we kind of pivot off all the time is really, what does the future of work look like? I.e., where are we headed? What are the tendencies and trajectories that we need to map out so people are aware of kind of what's coming down the road, but then also what should it look like? And that's the importance of organizations such as think tanks. It's basically kind of provide proposals to steer us in a certain direction, a direction of, in our case, a direction of sustainability, security, freedom, and equality, and so on. Now, I guess what we've tried to do from the get-go is really kind of take work in its broadest sense. So of course, we all know when we say work, we're talking about wage work, employment. But of course, work is not simply employment. It's not simply our jobs. With unpaid labours of the home, so things like food prep, cleaning, and so on. Very gendered work, predominantly carried out by women still. Even though we have higher rates of participation in the labour market, women still do the majority of work in the home. But then also things like shadow work. So it's the concept from Ivan Illich, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. But basically the kind of labours we do to kind of support the economy, which are not paid. So things like commuting. What is commuting? It's not really work in terms of employment, but it's not really free time either. It's something we have to do. So we wanted to kind of make sure that as an organisation, we weren't really just tied to a particular concept of what work is, and we can kind of expand that. So I think that's one of the main aims of Autonomy, is to really expand what a think tank can do, expand the concepts we're dealing with. Okay, sorry, I have to move fast. There's quite a lot to get through. Okay, so what is Autonomy today? So Julian gave a little sketch of our origin story, but we've grown quite a bit, and I think we've kind of spread into this slightly modular form, basically. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the final 2, but at the moment, as it stands, we have Autonomy Digital, which is effectively the kind of home of all of our work on data, the data economy, the platform economy, how to regulate big platforms, how to not just break up monopolies, but also how to think about how platform technologies can be used in more purposeful and, let's say, kind of enabling ways than the current form of the platform economy. That's broadly construed. I see Stephanie Sherman's in the crowd here as well, so she's been helping out with some of that, thinking through what, rather than just throwing platforms out altogether, how can platformization be kind of repurposed. The Autonomy Urban team, so that's Julian and a number of others. Obviously, I think our website was circulated beforehand, so you can go onto the Autonomy Urban site. Julian's going to be talking a lot more about some of the work they've been doing. I think the Autonomy Urban stuff I'm particularly pleased about, in a way, because ultimately it was one of the first, as Julian said, we met Julian very early on, and suddenly I could see the huge potential around having a much more visual, much more spatialized way of thinking, basically, which I think most think tanks really don't. So you have, in my head, I might be wrong about this, but you kind of have architectural practices, you have design schools, you have other parts of academia, and then you have campaigns and so on. And in general, think tanks as a sector, it's effectively, the outputs, reports, bullet points, really interesting ideas, but ultimately, often it's just at best a kind of design and doing some infographics. So for me, and this is what, Julian's really carved out this really nice niche within our sector, which is basically thinking through infrastructure, but visually, and spatially, and that's really fed into our policy work. So that's something which Julian will show you will demonstrate some of the ways we've been doing that. The consultancy team, which is basically myself and a couple others, who as we've developed our policy and research, we had firms from the private sector and the third sector come to us and say, look, the 4-day week's really interesting. We want to kind of trial it in our own organisation, in our charity, or in our kind of creative company, and so on. And effectively, that's wait. Can you go back a second, Julian? Sorry. That's basically we've started piloting 4-day weeks in firms, so running shorter working week trials in firms itself. And that's really important for us, because I think ultimately we don't want to just be an organisation that sits behind our research, sits behind our policy, at our laptops back. We want to be going into the shop floor of organisations and reorganising how they work in order to work less. Basically, that's for us an important aspect of how to push for change. Okay, so the two final modules, and I will move slightly faster. I'm aware that time's moving on. Are the Autonomy Data Unit and the Feminist Futures Programme. So the ADU joined us at the start of last year, and I think this is something which is particularly interesting for us to kind of expand and to kind of pursue, because our data unit aren't just, for example, economists who look at data sets and kind of produce readings and analysis. Our data unit is made up of physicists and mathematicians, basically, and I think that's something which we've only really just started to come to terms with the potential of what you can do with those who can kind of, let's say, crunch data at that scale. So the data unit joined us in early 2020. The COVID pandemic hit, and then for a good part of the year, we were producing studies at quite a pace, simply to try and keep up with the unfolding pandemic, the unfolding crisis. So this one on our screen here is JARI, which is the Jobs at Risk Index, which basically was a way of mapping employment data sets from the UK to the US, because the US database, which has the same list of jobs, also has as part of has a number of data points on the physical proximity of those jobs, whereas the UK data set does not. So by mapping those data sets, we could then have some idea as to kind of the risk of COVID exposure via the physical proximity that each job entails. So you can go on our site, check out that study. It's fully interactive. You can kind of zoom in, see all the different kind of employment data around each job, and that was one of our first implementations of the new kind of data work that we're doing. And we're looking to kind of expand that data unit into a more of a kind of well-staffed facility where we have a range of different scientists, basically. And I think that's something which in some sense, it connects us to an earlier stage of the 20th century, basically, where we're talking about things like operations research, where scientists are getting involved in strategic and kind of more. I think there's a line to be drawn there, which I think is quite interesting. Okay, and then finally, the Feminist Futures Programme, which is coming out, which is being launched next Monday. So we just put the Twitter handle out, but effectively this programme is going to last about 1 or 2 years. It's being led by Helen Hester, who Julian's mentioned a couple of times. She's been a close affiliate of ours from the very beginning of Autonomy. Now, the FFP is going to be really a kind of home for feminist theory, policy, design, all sorts of content coming through, and then as well as larger research projects and reports and so on. But effectively, what we felt there was a space available which goes beyond talking about the economy and gender in terms of things like pay gaps and the gender pay gap and things like that, and rather kind of speaking about other issues as well. So, talking about forms of work which often don't get a look in, forms of work which were kind of overlooked, things like sex work, forms of care which require responses not simply about pay rises, but kind of infrastructure, which is something Julian's going to be talking about. And so we wanted there to be a space where both the audiences who normally come to think tanks for research, they'll be confronted with material they've never really experienced before, but equally those who come from a more theory and design background can be exposed to policy demands and that kind of world as well. So it's kind of tying those two things together. So yeah, I watched this space basically for the FFP. Okay, I'll move slightly faster through these maybe. So effectively, the way we've kind of organically grown in a way beyond these modules is also to have a core team of individuals who kind of have multiple remits. So we're not talking about you get hired you have one remit and that's what you do all day. In fact, as Julian will tell you if you ever talk to him, there's multiple projects you kind of feed into, and you're doing multiple. You have kind of quite. Everyone kind of has to have quite wide skill set, and beyond that, you have close affiliates. So people like Helen or Nick Cernicek, as was mentioned, and others who've been working with for a long time, and they can kind of plug into projects here and there, and then a much wider network of expertise. Now, this is probably familiar to a lot of you, that ultimately now, because of the possibilities of being connected, ultimately, like, there is a wide pool of interesting expertise that can plug into all sorts. And what we need is basically have a home to kind of become a bit of a node for all these interesting different kind of individuals working on all sorts of things. And that's been partly my role, is to really kind of not quite headhunt, but ultimately kind of make contact with all sorts of initiatives, and see how we can augment and collaborate, basically. So it's we want to keep it as that have that kind of fluidity to it, because it's essential for us that often it's chance encounters that really, as with Julian, really kind of have the best outcomes. Okay, what's the next slide? Yeah, so I mean, ultimately it's important for us, on the same note of being fairly fluid, is that we have a diverse set of funders. So it's important for us, again, not to have like single large donors or grantees and so on, because we want our remit to be wide and to be flexible, and to be able to start projects which are cross-subsidized by all sorts of funding sources. So the Rosa Luxemburg Office, Gorilla Foundation, Alex Ferry Foundation are all really fantastic funders who recognize that having the space to pursue projects off our own initiative are really important, rather than having really tightly constrained outcomes. That's a fairly old way, a traditional way of looking at how to kind of fund research and more experimental ways of doing things. One thing I should say with Chase and Techne is that we have also tried to tap into the kind of wealth of basically talent that there is within the PhD community, basically. So AHRC or ERC funded PhD students often working on really interesting stuff, and so we kind of collaborated with Chase and Techne, which are AHRC consortiums, to basically have effectively a placement scheme whereby students are funded to work with us on really interesting projects, which we've really honed how to kind of make this those kind of initiatives really worthwhile for students. So I'd go on our site and check out things like the archaeogram from Armel from the RCA, or some for example, Phil, who's one of our key researchers now, he was a Chase placement student. So we think it's really important to have that relationship with the university, which gives people the opportunity to actually work outside of academia, basically. Okay, right, yes, the shorter working week. So let's talk about the journey of an idea, basically, and how we fit into this history of working time reduction. Okay, so obviously the working time reduction, or the shorter working week, or whatever you want to call it today, people call it the 4-day week. It's obviously an idea that's as old, at least as old as capitalism, basically. The idea that we should be working less, and effectively more life, less work. That's been going around for a long time. Marx in Capital he had a whole chapter on the reduction of the working day in England, the Factory Act, and so on. The move from the 12-hour day to the 11-hour day to the 10-hour day, and all sorts. So ever since that time when workers were bunched together in workplaces, predominantly factories, and basically worked to the bone for a set amount of time, working time's been a terrain of struggle, basically. Okay. Basically, for example, I mean, just as an example of this, the weekend, and every country is different. Every country will have their own story of how the weekend was born. For example, in Australia, I think it's in the 1860s, it was stonemasons who won the 8-hour day and had this march through Melbourne. In the UK, it was really after World War II when miners, construction workers, different sectors started kind of basically going on strike for the 44-hour week, 40-hour week. If you cut forward to the 1980s, you start having the glimmers of what's now called post-work, which is basically authors like Andre Gorse and others kind of arguing for, kind of coming to terms with post-industrialism in the global north, basically, and thinking through how this might be a chance in this kind of crisis of the manufacturing sector and so on, to basically think through, well, what can the future of work be in a more technologically augmented world where we still retain this demand for working time reduction, but in a changed world of work, basically. And you can see the mirrors today in our work. And ultimately this kind of revival of post-work thinking, starting really with Kathy Weeks in 2011, but then since then, I'm sure you've all seen a whole range of books from more popular figures like Rutger Bregman and Paul Mason, through to Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams here in 2015, David Frayn's work also from the same period, really reviving the idea that actually, working time reduction, it speaks to a kind of anti-work ethic in a way. So a kind of an ethic where we say, well, look, employment time is not free time. And if we care about free time or freedom, then ultimately we should take a much more unromantic look at work, particularly work which basically asks you to kind of give your all. So not just your kind of physical exertion, but also really your heart and your head. And that's the kind of more insidious side of saying that you should love what you do. And so again, just like Andre Gors in the 70s and 80s, we're now again kind of coming to a time where questioning particular forms of work today, whether that's the gig economy, that kind of precarity, or the kind of love what you do mentality, which is something which I think is particularly insidious. Okay, so where do we fit into this? Well, ultimately, think tanks speak in a very different register. Policy is not the same as a theoretical book, even if those theoretical works have like really real political implications. But our first major report was on the shorter working week itself, and that was kind of written in late 2018, and kind of consolidated a whole range of arguments, from the mental health angle on why we should work less, to an environmental angle, to a kind of productivity angle. There's a whole kind of knot of arguments there, which is really where we kind of distilled what's the kind of, let's say, what kind of policies or demands should politicians, activists, journalists be paying attention to around the shorter working week? And we like to think we played some part in bringing back the 4-day week or the shorter working week into more political discussions over the last 2 or 3 years. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, our consultancy really is a branch of this. So, we shouldn't consider the private sector as one big homogenous block. It's not just capital C. Actually, there's a whole kind of range of employers who want to be, to kind of like produce, will have decent working practices, want to try new ideas and so on. There's not just a totally resistant private sector. I mean, having said that, I don't expect Amazon to come calling anytime soon, but nonetheless, there's a growing number of employers thinking that actually the changing world of work is something they want to be part of and want to be those first movers. So we help those. We have no qualms about helping those organizations that want to reduce the working week with no loss in pay for their staff. So that's something we're really proud of. And then we also branched out into working with more government organizations. So the first of these, or state organizations, so the first of these was with the regional government of Valencia. So regional governments in Spain have much greater power and capacity than local governments do here in the UK. So that was very exciting for us to kind of be in contact with them. They saw our name in a Guardian article, which they really enjoyed, and they kind of invited us over. We kind of started thinking, how do we create this kind of really visionary document for Valencia? It's something they really wanted. It was the employment services there, Labora, which, to us, if the DWP in the UK came to someone and said, hey, we want you to do a project on the future of work, it would be like, alarm bells might be ringing, because the DWP doesn't have a great reputation in terms of how it deals with welfare and employment policies. But in Valencia, the Labora actually have some really forward-thinking ideas, some really, just to use that word again, infrastructural kind of plans for how the world of work is going to change and how the region needs to change with it. Compromise of the political party there, they're kind of in some ways similar to Podemos, a kind of left, very progressive party, a coalition of Greens and socialists and so on. And we basically were very much on the same page about the future of work. And now in that report, we set out a kind of plan for how the region could move to a shorter working week. What's the industrial strategy to do so? And then that was published in early 2020, just before the pandemic. We've stayed in contact with the regional authorities there. The report had made a huge splash in media, in Spanish media, in global media. John Stone from The Independent's been following it ever since. And as you might have read recently, the kind of proposal in Valencia was then taken to government, basically, and the Mas País party Spain now is really in a position where it's going to be running trials in over 200 different organizations and thrust of politics. Your policy proposals are never really put into a neutral space. On such prominence, there's always going to be a kind of fierce back and forth, a fierce fight. And so, as you might remember, in the 2019 general election, when the Labour Party put the 4-day week really slightly in its manifesto, the Conservatives really and the right-wing press really attacked the shorter working week as something which was ludicrous, which was outrageous, stupid even, and so it's never a clean kind of journey from idea from the idea stage or from this kind of history straight through to it being a good idea at a policy level. Things will, as always, a kind of a bumpy road, and so that's always going to be ongoing. You'll see more of that, the kind of back and forth as to whether the 4-day week is really going to work and so on. And to some extent, it's our, you know, as part of our research and policy, we really want to be making the case for why it's a progressive idea, and then that's going to have an evidence base, and that's going to have a really good communication strategy as well. So that's an ongoing part of our work.
Thank you, Will. Okay, so incredibly, pretty much on time. I'm going to now take us through an idea. This is something I've and I'm going to take us back to Spain. I wish physically. And this was actually the first occasion in which the urban team made a contribution to Autonomy's production. And we produced a chapter. At the time, it was myself and Stavros Ikonomidis, who maybe is in the audience tonight. And what we conceived is what we called new foundational infrastructures. And essentially, these were a collection of hardware and workspace for small businesses and cooperative business forms. For Valencia, we developed 3. One focusing on the digital and cognitive work, one on care, and one on business. Just one infrastructure, and it's journey from this project into others, and I'm also going to try and distill some of the principles that are guiding some of this work. So one of the strategic aims outlined in the report was to guard against the crisis of care. Now, Spain is aging at a faster rate than other countries in Europe. It's more doing care work in a certain area, and a set of services for those who are in need of care services. So the first principle I want to go over is the idea of expanding definitions of work and worker. And I want to pull up that slide again, the multiple senses of work slide, because it's interesting to think about what this means of care. Because care works both ways. And it might include food preparation, it might include cleaning. It also includes the caring sector, work that this, we had the help of the social inclusion service of the region, and it included care workers who were privately employed, nurses and social workers from the cooperative and public sector, but also family members who would be recognized as workers and have a space to go and share that work and share those experiences with other people. Now, the other principle I want to talk about is to expand the sphere of autonomy for workers and communities. Autonomy with a small a in this case. And for us in this scheme, that meant both creating the spaces for meetings and let's say democratic processes to take place. But it also meant not let's say not giving up on the presence of national and regional services. But what we recommended was to follow a strategy of fragmentation and what I call outnumbering, where you outnumber the service of the state or the region amidst an autonomous structure, which is worker-led and community-owned. These are other services for everyone, in fact, for the aged, for the care workers, both formally and informally employed, and family carers. And I guess the other principle I want to talk about, and this is the final principle that I want to talk about here, is to address tangible needs. And to talk about this, I want to sort of bring us to the second phase of this project, which, thanks to the help of the Alex Ferry Foundation, we took that sort of sub-chapter in the Valencia report and expanded it into its own report and adapted it, in fact, to the UK context. And this meant, I think, for us in this phase, really increasing our attention to practical and tangible services, both for workers. Here you can see the locker rooms for the care workers. We also devise quiet and napping areas. And this is mainly to address the sort of the flexible hours and precarious nature of care work. But it also meant providing tangible services to respond to the needs of those subjects in need of care and who might find themselves isolated in their own neighborhoods. And these practical needs, apart from representing, let's say, the basis for a needs-based aggregation of different kinds of workers and different subjects, it's also the kind of thing that makes sense and is easy to be picked up in the media. And this is the image actually that I wanted to finish on. And I wanted to sort of bring it back to the media. Essentially, I'm I don't know if Will's going to agree with this, but there is in a sense an attempt to use what what might catch the media's attention in some of these projects. So even though there is a sort of very long depth of thinking and of theory that goes into them, there also is a moment in which you say, okay, how's the Express going to pick this up? And I think, and this was actually thanks to Joe, who's our media whiz. Yeah, I don't know. I want to end on this sort of slightly trivial ending to that work, but it was actually one of the most rewarding moments of that process and of that project. Thank you very much. That was it.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you both very much for this very interesting and inspiring presentation. I think we should open it up to questions, but I have if I may ask a kind of preliminary question to both of you. I think it's a question that addresses the issues of design and let's say design practice, but also, as you said, media. So my question is, how do you use architectural drawings, architectural representations, photography, models, name it, in the not only in the development of the project, but also in the conversations that you have with other entities, and also in the way you are presenting this back to the public? I mean, the effectiveness of certain
So I think,
yeah.
So I think one thing to always keep in mind in here is the degree to which we live in a very visual moment, and using that is very important, to always sort of have an image at hand, to sort of point to what you mean is incredibly useful. And if those drawings have a sort of worked out blueprint effect, that is very powerful. So that's my initial. I actually mentioned the other day I sent a message to Will along with a screenshot of a drawing. I said, "Candy shop urbanism." Urbanism, which is often the risk that we end up sort of only representing sort of prototypes. But it is very important to have that sort of operational aesthetic, let's say. Will?
Well, I think, I mean, just to the extent that there's two ways of looking at this, or seeing the impact of this. On the one hand, you can see the sector changing from some, like, part of our influence on the sector has been to introduce these more visual languages, which has then had knock-on effects, and with people who work within the policy sector who think, actually, yeah, this actually really is useful. To some extent, what was a bit of an experiment to introduce much more visual thinking has then had kind of played out within the sector. And the other way of looking at it is I mean, fine, I'm not going to make any grand claims about what diagrams do, but at least to some extent, it seems what they do is to simplify what is also complex. And so, for example, our Mel Skatulski, who's produced this archaeogram we put out last month, was basically effectively a visual mapping of the platform, of the data economy, from the workplace and the kind of wearable technologies, RFIDs, to right up to infrastructures of storage and so on. And that kind of imagery, we're getting bolder with kind of, rather than having 90-page reports, you have a much the kind of the story of the research, the story of the picture you're painting is literally a way more diagrammatic. And that for us is becoming the way that we produce things now. That report I mentioned, the shorter working week report, that was like a 90-page report, but we tend to not do those anymore, partly because messaging is much more powerful, we find, when it via the visual medium.
I just want to add something to this, which is about space itself and not so much about drawings. The idea with the new foundational infrastructures is that along with, let's say, monetary resources, what we should be doing is supporting different realities and individuals with hardware. And this sits at an awkward place in between planning and sort of work policy. And I think that is the space that we're trying to carve out a little bit here, which is about saying actually space, workspace, hardware, physical services, those should all be inscribed into policy itself and should be understood as, in a sense, as a part of welfare. So yeah, I think that's another really important point to make about all this work.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I will leave it to others to ask first. Elena, do you have a question?
Elena's mute.
Oh, yeah. Now you're on mute, yes.
And now she's on mute.
Hi, Julian. Nice to see you. Hi,
Hi,
Platon, and everyone else.
Hi.
Nice to see you all. I kind of like, it's a bit of a family gathering. So nice. A kind of a celebration, to see other people other than one's, nearest and dearest. What a relief. So I guess this is more of an open question to try and establish, what Autonomy is thinking about Kate Soper's current thinking on post-growth living, and how you see your infrastructures of care might enable us to make various transitions, whether they're transitions into a post-carbon world or post-pandemic world or indeed post-consumption world, and how the 4-day week alongside, a reclaiming of automation, but for the common good, as opposed to extractive aspects of it, how degrowth sits alongside the challenge of recalibrating how we understand definitions of work and what that might be in the future. What are the metrics that we might have to use to revalue what it is we do and what we do with it? So it's a kind of an ambiguous phrased question, because it's what I'm trying to make these connections myself, according to kind of a vast and strange array of readings, from, degrowth to hedonism, to understanding the difference between autarky and autarkia, and where that leads us in terms of provisioning and self-sufficiency in a manner that goes beyond what we're told we need to assume those terms mean.
I'm going to let Will answer this, but I just want to say that this debate about we often find this tension between sort of degrowthers and Green New Deal supporters to be a somewhat of a false dichotomy, ultimately. I can sort of just to speak to the infrastructures, to the new foundational infrastructures. There is a willingness to draw consumption and to draw work into a sustainable model, and to somehow create the terms of access based on that sustainability into a new business arena or business commons. That might have been a bit convoluted.
I think there's quite a lot in your question, particularly asking for, the new metrics. That is the big question, and ultimately behind the question of metrics is the question of a different political economy, which is, again, an even bigger question. I think I think, I mean, the Kate Soper's book is sparks off lots of interesting conversations. I think to the extent that often these consumption conversations can kind of sometimes stray into being a little bit like, isn't our consumption bad? We should just be slightly kind of, consume better. I think Kate Soper's book goes some way into basically, thinking quite seriously about it, but I guess perhaps we would take a few further steps into thinking about kind of, let's say, more structured what am I trying to say here, Julian? I'm trying to say, I guess I feel like the best thing that the Kate Soper's book, in my mind, raised is the idea of thinking about alternative modes of hedonism as a way of basically allowing us to direct ourselves out of the forms of consumption by which we currently do fulfill some desires, and by which, let's say, capitalist economies do fulfill some of our desires. And we have to be real about that. We can't say that these are false desires. These forms of consumption are somehow kind of like spoiling the human condition, because I feel like that's a dangerous road to go down when we think of some kind of essentialism. So I think that hedonism angle is really, really important. And Kate Aronoff's book with Ria Frankos, and I can't for the life of me, I can't remember.
Cohen, I think.
Their book on the Green New Deal also brings this up as well, that ultimately, anything like a Green New Deal or any kind of degrowth initiative really does need to have an element of desire, which is a really crucial political ingredient. Not only, so practically, but also obviously it's something which is literally desirable. On the shorter working week, yes, I mean we always talk about the kind of really important research that's been done around the place of a shorter working week in a decarbonized economy. Juliet Shaw's work on this is pretty good. There's also good work on kind of like indexing household consumption by its carbon intensity, and seeing that those households that work longer hours have a greater carbon intensity than those who work shorter hours. I mean, there's some good papers out there on that, and our site we have a kind of a collation document of some of the best research on that. So I think it has to be part of the package, basically. And I think the Green New Deal, even though some of the initiatives kind of fall back on like kind of an industrialism or industrialist idea of the future, in terms of like, let's just have the old manufacturing world but with green jobs, I think it's important to recognize that part of that old world, particularly the post-war world, was basically about advocating for shorter working hours. So Roosevelt's New Deal and the post-war Britain, for example, just two examples, they had the shortening of the working week was part of that new wave of industrialism. So ultimately, if we're talking about a quote unquote return to an industrial revolution, but with kind of green industry, then ultimately, are we really going to, what's the plan for the working week? Is it going to still be 40 hours like it was 80 years ago? Or should we be moving to a shorter working week, a shorter working week than our average kind of 40-hour week as it stands? So it's what I'm saying there, basically, it still needs to be introduced properly into some of the main parts of these proposals. The degrowth side, it's been there for decades. Degrowth's always been on shortening the working week. That's been that's part of the parcel. But I guess the political project at the moment is the Green New Deal, right? That like the degrowth doesn't really have, I mean, you probably know better than me, but I don't really know what the rival degrowth political project is to the Green New Deal as it's espoused by people like Ocasio-Cortez or the Labour Party in the UK, for example. So yeah, there's a few things there. I'm not sure I can't answer your question about what the new metrics are, because that, again, as I say, it explores wider. I think, for example, just one thing I'd say on that, for example, is productivity. I think that's really something we need to address head on these days. I think too often productivity is used to kind of basically beat workers over the head for not being productive enough. And we keep talking about, we can't have nice things in our economy because we're not productive enough and so on. But as the climate crisis grows closer, it becomes basically not only that it becomes dangerous, but as our economies are becoming much more service-based and much more kind of fragmented in terms of the kind of work we do, things like care work and stuff, where productivity is basically, as normally measured, very, very low. I think the idea of having an economy based on how its success is based on productiveness is basically dead in the water, I think. Anyway, that's my bold claim.
You're mute, Elena.
It wasn't really meant, as give me an answer. I mean, I just kind of to try and find gaps, points of leverage in which, as spatial practitioners, we might start to use our visioning and our critical visioning tools and sensitivities to try and actually orchestrate what we do with this extra time, and how our drawing of it might start to give shape and form in a projective sense of what happens, when we do have this additional time. So I think that's why the work that, Julian is doing with you, I think is very instructive, not only to illustrate proposals, but to also, I guess, be suggestive and projective and speculative of what these collective infrastructures might offer this transition. So, I mean, it's really meant as a kind of long-winded high five, and that it's great that you see a scope for spatial imagination to work alongside the policy agenda that you're setting.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Elena. Anyone else? Any question? If I may, then I will ask another one, which is about the relation between, let's say, writing of policy document and also writing of the brief, of the design brief. So the way or even to make it slightly more complex, I mean, the line that connects the consultancy, the I would call it the commission in some way. So someone comes in and says, we're looking into this. And they respond in two different ways, the writing of a policy, but also the writing of a brief, and how do they work together? Maybe that's a question for both.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just going to briefly answer with another project we've been working on, which is
Great.
It's called the Nocturnal Commons that we're working on. I think
Great.
I have Louis. I think I have Louis. I think Louis is somewhere here, who is somebody who's been working on it with us very, very closely. And I think the reason I want to tell that story is because that is the sort of ideal process in which we do this. We've been spending the past few months both with one of our PhD funded student interns and actually with a class from LSE. We've been researching the nighttime economy based on three different subjects of, let's say, precarious labor of the night, which are sex workers, delivery riders, and care workers. We've been doing a lot of research. First of all, to sort of frame the night as an environment, to sort of as a condition to address for different categories of workers. And now we've been consulting with representatives from unions and collectives of workers to actually test some of those ideas. And we're going to have a bit of a few rounds of the back and forth round tables with union reps and workers themselves to co-design those projects. And I guess where the brief emerges is at some stage of that process, we start developing design principles or guidelines which are very much similar to those two or three that I showed here in the presentation, although maybe a bit more detailed. And those end up guiding the design of the services and to an extent of the spaces. I don't know if Will wants to add anything to all that.
No, I think that's pretty good.
Thanks. But yeah, that's a project that we're really excited about. So watch that.
And how do you think this connects with, for example, education? So I mean, as a process of thinking through problems or thinking through writing and designing? I mean, how do you think it works within education? I mean, if we take this example, how would that work within a teaching and learning environment, you think?
Yeah. So in the case of this project, we've actually been working with some students from LSE, and actually in all the courses that we've been teaching in various universities, I think what we bring is a connection to worker movements and to grassroots organizations. And I think not just the conversations, but actually sort of helping them think through what lived experience means in sort of these workers, means then sort of how that can be translated into policy and into design is certainly sort of our main question. Yeah, it's a very open question, because this is early days, and we're sort of teaching it as we develop it. So a lot of the teaching is actually the opportunity for us to think through these issues, and actually a lot of the principles. I see some of our students here this evening at the RCA, and Stephanie is here as well this evening too. But we've been developing principles to redesign award in Hackney, and that's been very much a collaborative process.
I think there's I mean, I don't know, I'm thinking on the fly here, but I think it's interesting that what's essential for us is to be able to have the space and time to be able to change gear or change direction. And I'm not sure, I think there are greater constraints in an educational setting wherein either it's between student and lecturer. There's obviously there are certain constraints that are required for a course to persist, or because there's simply not enough time, and ultimately changing gear can be quite. So I think I always think back to these kind of like, particularly there was, I mean, this is going to sound weird, but basically during World War II and after that in NASA, you'd have teams which in some cases there would be teams which were allowed to kind of just run with stuff and then see kind of tinker around. And I think to some extent trying to recreate some of that environment, that kind of environment, is actually something which has been very good for us in terms of like, okay, look guys, some of our self-made projects they're very much are self-made, and this Nighttime Commons project, for example, is one which we're very happy to pursue, with the freedom knowing that actually it'll take as long as it takes. There'll be twists and turns to it. There'll be some things we didn't expect, for example, coming back from the workers we talked to. So I think for an educational context, if it's possible to create as free an environment as that, in which you have that kind of, I mean, I don't use the word experimental, it's used too much, but literally the ability to experiment and see kind of if the world pushes back, then that's fundamental, I think, for us. But yeah,
I think the challenge there is always to sort of find a bite-sized enough thing that can actually sort of make sense in a global way. For a 3-month project, a 6-month project, a 9-month project, it's always sort of gauging what the right bite size is, and I'm working on that.
Great, thank you both. Alberta, do you want to ask something? Because I saw that you turn on your camera, but I don't want to put you in the spot. So if you don't want to ask, that's fine.
You're mute, Alberta.
You're mute. We cannot hear you.
No, she's not mute. It's just her microphone's not working.
Yeah, your mic is not working. Now it's working.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Great,
very
great.
well fast on. Sorry for the digital drama, as always.
Nice to see
you. You too. I just wanted to take you back maybe to the 4-day-a-week thinking. And I mean, I'm obviously so on board on a kind of like societal level, totally agree. And we all want to go down to fewer working hours. But the thing that I'm kind of grappling with personally is I'm finding I actually enjoy some of my work at the very least, and I've actually gone down to 4 days a week, but then I've crammed the other 3 days with kind of like my side hustle, which is totally work, and I should be seeing it as work, but actually I'm finding it kind of like, where do you draw the line between work and hobby, and kind of valuing your work that you enjoy, which you're ultimately always going to undervalue. And I mean, last time I spoke to you, Julian, I know you're very much working more than you could fit into a week. So yeah, how do you kind of deal with that at the organization? Because I'm sure you're all incredibly stretched. Is it kind of drawing a line between work and activism? Or yeah, are there different types of work and another way that you can kind of dissect that?
That's a really good question. I think there's one way of answering that, which is basically to say, we've moved from an organization which was basically set up as set up part as a side project, and then becomes more and more as it grows. You then have to put things in place to make sure that, it doesn't become something which you're really passionate about, and then just basically takes over all of your life, including your spare time. So it's an interesting question about when you come out of an embryonic form of a particular kind of organization, and then you move into becoming, let's say, a much more down the line, running like 9-to-5 company or whatever. Or actually, our full-time workers, we do work 4-day weeks. The problem is, alongside of our autonomy work, we also have all sorts of other things, basically. So like, whatever, I'm writing a book, it can be very stressful. That's something which like is work, and it's kind of filled in the nooks and crannies of other parts of my life, and the same with Julian and others as well. So I think, and then just one more thing on that as well is also that another category of work which we could have included in our little list of wage work, unpaid labours of the home, shadow work, is also just the normal sense in which we talk about work, which is just, or not normal sense, but one of the normal sense, which is just like hard work. Oh, I'm working in my garden, I'm whatever, it's work which like, let's say, self-directed work, which is, as you mentioned, is something which you undervalue in terms of the market, or you undervalue in terms of, you think, well, it's not paid, so blah blah, but you also really value because it's something which is like self-pursued and autonomous and so on. And so yes, that's an important part. In some ways, we're trying to expand that space so you can have self-directed work. We're not I don't think we should be anti-work, which is basically kind of like an expression of our own autonomy. Now, having said all that, which like these are all the caveats, I do think there is a certain I think sound that myself, and perhaps you too, although I don't necessarily know, is that I think we're both in, it feels like a lot of us can be in positions where the idea that we're overrun by work which is our own self-directed work, and sometimes it's hard to find, hard to delineate work that you don't like from you do, like that to some extent is a certain, I feel like I'm quite lucky to be able to do that. Whereas I think a lot of people are in jobs that they're just doing for a means to an end. And so demarcating when work ends and when life begins is actually really useful and important. And so, we might say, oh, well, if you say, do you love your work? Someone might say yes. But if you say, okay, well then why don't you work over the weekend? They'd be like, whoa. Can we actually, it is important to me that I don't have, for example, the discipline of the workplace like on me on the weekend, and actually it would be great if I had more of it. So just making those delineations is quite important. And I think beyond, like, for example, I know a friend of mine, Guy Standing, he's a big basic income advocate, but he doesn't really like the shorter working week, because he thinks shorter working week is, he says, well, we've all got different projects going on and so on and so forth, and he often skips over the issue. And I think actually, that might be for certain professions that you have, your working time's fluid and different and so on. But actually for a lot of people, working time, it's very clear when's work time and when they're off having, enjoying themselves.
Yeah, 100%. That's to me, I mean, it really depends on I guess how much of your work is how much you have to invest into your persona to to work as well. I think that we have a report that came out a couple years ago about the labors of employability, which ultimately a lot of it can really be a lot of that self-directed work. And I think that's always the anxiety. Am I doing this because I enjoy it? Am I doing this because it's sort of making me more employable in a sort of absolute sense? I think that's really that's really what we should be asking ourselves, and sort of who is, how much of it is self-directed, and how much of it is actually sort of responding to a wider expectation to sort of build your employable profile. Thanks. I think Sarah was about to ask a question too. Hi, Sarah. You're mute as well, I think.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for the excellent presentation. I think it's always wonderful to see your work and how you're tying in different disciplines and trying to bring in as to how your architectural practice could have a difference. To that end, I wanted to actually understand in terms of the work that you're doing, and especially in vision of autonomy. You mentioned earlier that it's a special kind of a think tank. And think tanks have generally existed in terms of also in terms of the kind of scale of impact that they can have, right? Because they're so closely tied in with policy. In that sense, I want to understand, is there something in terms of a vision that you have in terms of what your scale of impact is? Are there any measures that you have, quantitative, qualitative, whatever they may be, short-term, long-term, etc., in terms of just, thinking of, because you are doing a lot of work in terms of social change, but are there any ways in which you're thinking about that as well?
Sorry, metrics for impact?
Well, I mean, they don't need to be really metrics, but because I'm also wondering, in terms of talking to, say, decision makers, many a times the way that you approach them is through these metrics that you've achieved as well, right? Through past work that you've done. And I'm wondering, how are you approaching that in some ways, in terms of, even scaling up your impact in that sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a good question. In some sense, I think perhaps our whole sector is constantly trying to grapple with, how to measure and also how to have greater impact, basically. I think for us, we see our position as we have I wouldn't say a responsibility, but we have the opportunity to be able to augment all sorts of different initiatives in quite a rapid and kind of quite bespoke way, whereas I think large organizations find it hard to be able. I think in large organizations you'd say, "Oh, I'd love to be able to help that campaign, or I'd love to be able to help that, that politician, or be able to plug into this, but we've got so much going on," and so on. So I think for us, we have that fortune of being able to kind of augment, for example. So let's take an example. If there are, for example, renters unions, there's a growing set of renters unions, from Acorn to London Renters Union to Living Rent and so on. A lot of these organizations don't have capacity to do research themselves, but we've chosen to be able to augment their campaigns with decent data work, visualizations, and so on. And for us, it's important that ultimately, it's about your position with relation to all these different actors in a way. We like to see ourselves as and we want us to think of us as potential collaborators on pushing, let's say, agendas which we think are important to ourselves. So whether it's local authorities, I think that's one entry point which Julian has alluded to with Valencia, but then also in terms of, we're working with a public body in Wales on this, or local councils. So in a way of getting some of these ideas and that thinking into local authorities and other, let's say, state institutions is very, very important. And obviously there's lots of really good people who want to make the change in that direction, who are looking for kind of external organizations to augment their initiatives. You have obviously you have a whole range of politicians who are interested in championing new ideas, in kind of being first movers on kind of like future economic thinking, which is incredibly important, that people are on hand, that, as to use Milton Friedman's phrase, that these are the ideas lying on the ground. And then beyond that, I think for us, as well as the general media stuff, which you're aware of, and it is important to have that content, to have that people in people's eye line. Alongside that, working with industry and the private sectors and the forward thinking aspects of the private sector. So none of that is really measurable, and that wasn't really your question. But for us, it's important to fire on all of these cylinders, such that and they can feed into each other, right? Like if you're working with a local authority here, then you have like a business case over here, and you have politicians who often each of these actors ask about each other. They all ask, what's the conversation going on in in the private sector, or how are activists talking about this issue, and so on. So I guess for us, it's while impact is really hard to measure, it's also important that we're making sure that we are finding all avenues in order to do that, including billboards, as you can see there.
Yeah, I just brought this image up because that was certainly part of the conversation around these billboards when we were designing them. What are our actual sort of avenues for impact and for getting the word out? Is it just media, or could we take it a step further? And this was an example of sort of thinking a little bit outside the box, which was not in radical ways, but still it meant.
Amazing. I think that's a very nice way to conclude with this billboard. You can put it back full screen, so everyone will see it at the end of the presentation.
Right.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Julian, Will. This is really a fantastic presentation, very inspiring, and a type and way of working that I think will have a major impact in the years to come. It's already having a very important impact in the organization of political disputes, in organization of political thinking. And I'm glad that we had this presentation from you this evening. Thank you so much, and we will be in touch. That's for sure.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We're really honored and grateful.
Great. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.